The War for Independence was over. The former 13 colonies and Great Britain signed the Treaty of Paris. Well, they signed a Treaty of Paris. Anyway, it put an official end to the war. America was a free nation. The American diplomats secured a very generous peace deal. The state's borders were extended from the Appalachian Mountains all the way to the Mississippi, and the new nation received fishing rights off the coast of Newfoundland. In return, the 13 states guaranteed that any Loyalist property seized during the war would be returned or reimbursed, and prevent the mistreatment of the Tories in the future. The treaty was sent to the Confederation Congress for the official ratification, where it just sat on a table for a while. Not enough states had even shown up to Congress to make peace official. Congress eventually got their act together and ratified the treaty in January. Ben Franklin and John Adams remained in Europe to serve as the American ambassadors to France and Great Britain. The third diplomat, John Jay, returned to America a hero. Congress offered him the position of Secretary of Foreign Affairs. Jay accepted with conditions. He could already see that the federal government was extremely weak, so he made sure that states understood that he would be speaking on their behalf whenever treaties were made with other nations. He also forced Congress to stop bouncing around from city to city and permanently move the capital to his home city of New York. The new Western territory that Jay secured sparked a debate in Congress. Most of the new states had old colonial charters that granted huge strips of land that theoretically gave them claim to land all the way to the Pacific. They argued that these charters still applied, meaning their borders went all the way to the Mississippi. These claims often overlapped, causing border skirmishes between the several states. The Northwest Territory was a particular mess. Virginia, New York, Massachusetts, and Connecticut all had these ridiculous sprawling claims as far as modern-day Minnesota. Virginia surprised everyone by giving up its claims in the Northwest. Between the uncooperative settlers there, skirmishes with the Indian tribes, and the British, it was more trouble than it was worth. Thomas Jefferson proposed to Congress that the rest of the states give up their land claims in the Old Northwest, so that the territory could eventually organize itself into new states. He argued that the huge western territories held by the states were no different than colonies. If they ruled the people living there, they'd be no better than the British had been. His resolution also contained a provision that the states made from the Northwest Territory would abolish slavery no later than 1800. The slavery provision was narrowly voted down, but the following year Congress passed an ordinance that formalized how land was to be divided and organized. Surveyors would divide land into ranges. Each range was divided into a 6-by-6 mile township. The township was further subdivided into 36 sections, each a square mile. The proceeds from selling the 16th section out of every township was put towards the school funding of that township. The proceeds from all the other sections went toward the national debt. Once the land could be surveyed and sold, Congress would have its first reliable source of revenue. The whole thing was uncharacteristically efficient and pragmatic of Congress, and over time other states would follow Virginia's lead and give up their huge land claims in the Old Northwest. This was all great on paper, but remember that this land that Congress was dividing up and selling was already occupied. The Treaty of Paris said nothing about the territory held by the Indian tribes in the West. The British had just given the land to the new United States without consulting them. Obviously, this didn't sit well with the First Nations, and hostilities continued. The United States attempted to make peace with the Six Nations, the Cherokee, and the Ohio Confederacy through a series of one-sided treaties where their diplomats were pressured into giving up large sections of their land. Most of these treaties were understandably never ratified, and border tensions between their nations and the settlers escalated. The British were eager to add fuel to the fire, and supplied the First Nations with weapons through forts in the Old Northwest. Speaking of Western forts, why were the British still there? They were clearly in American territory. When John Jay pointed this out, the British replied that actually the Americans weren't abiding by the Treaty of Paris. Loyalists had their land and property confiscated, and they were not reimbursed, a clear violation of the treaty. This was a good point. Why had America broken the agreement? The Confederation Congress was doing a really bad job at getting states to abide by the terms of the treaty. New York was a great example of this. The confiscation of Loyalist property in upstate New York was especially popular. Before the war, there had been a lot of wealthy Loyalist landowners in upstate New York. They had depended on tenant farmers to do the actual farming, but during and after the Revolution, New York had partitioned and redistributed these large landowners' farms to their former laborers. Now these small independent farmers were property-owning voters, and they became a powerful bloc in New York politics. Their newfound political power was based on redistribution of Loyalist property, and they had no desire to give it up. Jay was like, okay, that's fair. When America stops mistreating the Tories, then the British would abandon American territory in the West. Jay confronted Congress, where he told them that the treaties that Congress signed were the law of the land, meaning that the states that Congress represented had to follow federal decisions made through those treaties. This applied to the Treaty of Paris, the loans that states were supposed to be helping repay, and to the actual Articles of Confederation, which states were treating as a joke. The thing is, a majority of Congress agreed with Jay, and they passed resolutions telling the states to stop abusing the Loyalists, and while they're at it, pay the requisitions that they owed Congress, and maybe also stop trying to invade Pennsylvania, Connecticut. The state governments refused to do all three of these things. Jay had failed to make the states abide by the treaty, so the British Army remained in US territory. America had a rocky relationship with the British and the Indian tribes, but they also had a third neighbor, the Spanish. They had helped the colonies during the War for Independence. Maybe their friendship could continue after the war. Unfortunately, geopolitics is never that simple. The settlement of Western Territory was completely reliant on the Mississippi River. Roads to the western settlements were so bad that it was cheaper and quicker for farmers to float their produce down the Mississippi, sell it in Spanish New Orleans, and transport it all the way around Florida to the East Coast, rather than go over the Appalachian Mountains. In 1784, the Spanish closed the Mississippi to American settlers out west. Since they owned New Orleans, they could turn away American merchants that wanted to sell their produce in the city. This action has another name, a blockade, an act of war. But what could America do? Even against the declining Spanish Empire, they were powerless to retaliate. John Jay met with the Spanish ambassador, with orders from Congress to convince the Spanish to open the Mississippi back up. This term, according to Congress, was non-negotiable. The Spanish ambassador would not budge on reopening the Mississippi, but he gave Jay a counteroffer. The United States could not use the Mississippi for 25 years, and in return the Spanish would allow the US to trade with their colonies in the Caribbean. These terms greatly favored northern states, which tended to have more merchants and less western territory than southern states. They couldn't care less that the Mississippi was closed. On the other hand, trading rights in the Caribbean meant basically nothing to the agrarian South, but they had a lot to lose from access being cut off from the Mississippi. Jay figured that either way the Mississippi was going to remain closed, so he might as well get some trade concessions out of the Spanish. Plus, New York had a lot of merchants. The treaty would be good for his home state. He brought the treaty to Congress to be ratified. The southern states saw the treaty as a northern conspiracy to strengthen the mercantile states at the expense of the agrarian South. All the southern states voted against the treaty. The Caribbean and the Mississippi both remained closed to all 13 states, leaving no one happy. The treaty being voted down was a huge failure. The closure of the Mississippi was a blow to the future settlement of the nation, and an overall humiliating diplomatic defeat that signaled to other nations that the US could be bullied and there was nothing they could do to retaliate. A delegate from South Carolina, Charles Pinckney, proposed that the states attend a convention to revise the Articles of Confederation. His proposal was voted down, just like Hamilton's in 1783. John Jay wrote to Washington about his experience as Foreign Secretary. Jay, like Hamilton, was of the opinion that the government was in desperate need of reworking. He tried to gauge Washington's opinion on the Articles of Confederation. Washington thoroughly agreed that the government needed to be reworked, but he did not believe that the states could be convinced at that moment. They would need the state of the country to get even worse, which incidentally wouldn't be too much longer.